To the rest of Oakfield, Ontario, we were the Mercer family, old money, old name, old pride. My father, Stuart Mercer, had built a commercial real estate empire across southern Ontario that stretched from Hamilton to Kingston. And he wore that success the way some men wear cologne, loudly, and always in the room before he was. I was 23 when he threw me out, not figuratively. Not in the way people say my parents kicked me out and mean they stopped paying for things. I mean, he called me into his study on a Sunday evening in January, slid a manila envelope across the mahogany desk, and told me that what was inside was the last thing I would ever receive from him. Inside was a check for $2,000 and a typed letter, signed and notarized, stating that I, Owen Mercer, was voluntarily relinquishing any and all future claim to the Mercer family estate, assets, and business interests. He'd had it prepared in advance. He'd had a lawyer draw it up before he even told me what I'd supposedly done wrong. "Sign it," he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was looking at the window. "Dad, sign it, Owen, or I call the police and tell them what you said to your stepmother at dinner last month." What I had said to my stepmother at dinner was that I knew she had been funneling money from my father's property management accounts into a personal holding company registered under her maiden name. I had the bank statements. I had shown them to my father in private a week before that dinner, and he had told me I was being paranoid and jealous, and that I needed to grow up. I signed the letter. I drove to my cousin Addie's apartment in Guelph that night with 2 bags and a laundry hamper, and I sat at her kitchen table and didn't say anything for about 40 minutes while she made tea. Addie was 26, worked as a dental hygienist, and had a studio apartment that was barely large enough for one person. She gave me her couch without hesitation, without a single word about how inconvenient it was, and I have never once forgotten that. "You knew this was coming," she said finally, not as a criticism, just as a fact. "I thought he'd believe me," I said. She looked at me with the kind of patience you develop when you've watched someone make the same mistake for years. "Owen, he married her 8 months after your mum died. He's never going to believe you." She was right. I knew she was right. I had known it on some level since the evening I first found those statements, printed off quietly at the library because I didn't trust the printer at home, and sat in my car in the parking lot reading through them twice to make sure I wasn't misreading something. My stepmother, Renata, had incorporated a company called 3147 Westbrook Holdings Limited 18 months earlier. Since then, Stuart Mercer's primary property management company had been issuing payments to Westbrook for consulting services. The payments totaled just under $400,000 over 14 months. My father's company employed 17 people. It did not need a consultant. What I didn't have was what any lawyer would call sufficient evidence. Bank statements showing payments to a holding company were suggestive. They were not proof of anything criminal on their own, and without my father's cooperation, which was clearly not coming, I had nothing actionable. So I took Addie's couch. I found a job through a temp agency doing data entry for a logistics firm in Kitchener. I ate a lot of grocery store rotisserie chicken and tried not to think about the fact that I had grown up in a 9-bedroom house on the escarpment and was now wearing the same 4 shirts in rotation because I'd left most of my clothes behind. That was February. By April, the $2,000 was gone. It was my Aunt Lorraine who called me about the property. My mother's sister. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 years, not because we'd had a falling out, but because grief makes people strange and quiet, and after my mother died, we had both gone strange and quiet in different directions. She called on a Tuesday morning while I was on my lunch break eating a sandwich in my car. "I don't know if you know this," she said, without much preamble, because Lorraine had never been a preamble sort of person, "but your grandfather left you something. In his will. Specifically. My grandfather on my mother's side, Franklin Adair. He had died the previous October, and I had gone to the funeral in Sudbury and cried and driven home and tried not to think about it too much, because thinking about it led directly to thinking about my mother, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. "I thought everything went to the estate," I said. "Most of it did. but he had a separate codicil, added it about 2 years before he died. He left you the fish camp. I went quiet for a second. The one up north? I said. On Wanapite? That's the one. It's been sitting empty since 2019. Nobody's touched it. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving it to you specifically, not even me. I only found out because his executor finally got around to the filing last month and I asked to see a copy. I hadn't been there since I was maybe 15. It wasn't really a camp so much as a small property my grandfather had bought in the late 1980s on the eastern shore of Lake Wanapite, about 40 minutes northeast of Sudbury. There was a main cabin, a woodshed, a dock that was probably rotted through by now, and about 2 acres of spruce and birch backing onto Crown land. He had used it every summer until his health made the drive too difficult. After that, it had sat. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure what a derelict fish camp in northern Ontario was going to do for my situation, but something about it made my throat tighten in a way I didn't expect. Why didn't he tell me? I asked. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. I think he knew something, she said carefully. He asked me about your father, about 2 years before he died. He was sharp right until the end, your grandfather. He asked questions and he listened, and he didn't say much, but he asked. I took the rest of the afternoon off work, the first time I'd done that, and drove to Sudbury the following Saturday. The road out to the property was worse than I remembered. It left the highway just past Capriole and turned to gravel after about 3 kilometers, winding through stands of white pine and rock cuts before opening up along the lakeshore. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. When I finally pulled up to the gate, a simple aluminum farm gate, padlocked, I sat in the car for a moment and looked at it. The chain on the gate was old. The padlock was not. It was a heavy master lock, newer than anything else on the property, and it had a tag on it from a Sudbury locksmith, dated 2021. Someone had replaced this lock after my grandfather stopped coming here. I wasn't sure what to make of that. The key Lorraine had given me was on a plain ring with a small wooden tag, the kind you'd get at a hardware store. It was worn smooth from handling. I turned it over in my hand and then climbed out of the car. The lock opened on the first try. The cabin itself was in better shape than I'd expected. The roof had held, which was the main thing. The windows were intact, the door was solid, and when I got inside, the air smelled like pine and old wood smoke and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. Someone had stacked firewood inside the door, not decades ago either. The wood was still pale, not yet darkened by time. I stood in the middle of the main room and turned around slowly. My grandfather had been a tidy man. The kitchen counter was clear. The 2 bunks in the back room had their wool blankets folded on them. On the small table near the window there was a kerosene lamp, a box of matches, and an envelope. The envelope had my name on it, Owen, in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on lined paper in the careful, slightly formal way he'd always written things down, like each word was considered before it was committed. He didn't start with an explanation or an apology. He started with a story. He wrote that in 1987, when my mother was 17, he had borrowed money from a business associate to expand his hardware store in Sudbury. The loan had been for $60,000. He had repaid it in full over 4 years. But the man he'd borrowed from, a developer named Clifton Ward, had kept a copy of the original loan documents, and in the late 1990s, Ward's son, Desmond, had used those documents to pressure my grandfather. Desmond Ward claimed there had been interest terms my grandfather had failed to honor. The amounts he cited were fabricated, but the legal costs of fighting it would have bankrupted my grandfather's store, and so he had paid. He had paid Desmond Ward a total of $82,000 over 6 years to make him go away. My grandfather wrote that he had kept records of every single payment. He wrote that he had kept other records too. Things he had learned about Desmond Ward over those years, because when someone is extorting you, you pay attention to them, you learn what you can, and you wait. He wrote that he had never been able to use what he found. He was too old and too tired by the time he understood what it meant, and he had no one he trusted enough to hand it to. Except, he wrote, he had a feeling about me. He wrote that I had my mother's honesty and that honest people have a harder life than they deserve, but they are also the only people capable of doing certain necessary things. He wrote, I don't know what you'll need this for. I only know that you might. And I know you'll do what's right with it. Behind the letter, folded and paper clipped together, were 47 pages of documents. Bank records, photocopied correspondence, a certified copy of a land transfer agreement, 2 affidavits from individuals I didn't recognize, both notarized. I sat down on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit and read every page in the fading afternoon light. Desmond Ward wasn't just an extortionist. Over a roughly 12-year period, he had used the same basic method, fabricated or inflated debt claims, to extract money from at least 6 small business owners in the Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie areas. 3 of them were listed by name in the affidavits. 2 of those individuals, my grandfather noted in a margin in pencil, had since died. But the most significant document was near the bottom of the stack. It was a photocopy of a share transfer agreement dated 2014. It showed Desmond Ward transferring a 40% ownership stake in a numbered company, 8T82649 Ontario Inc., to a co-shareholder. The co-shareholder's name was listed in full, Stuart Mercer, my father. I read it 3 times. Then I set it down on the floor beside me and looked at the lake through the window. The light was going orange. A loon called somewhere in the distance, that long, echoing sound that carries across northern Ontario water in a way that sounds like something from a long time ago. My father and Desmond Ward were business partners, had been since 2014, at minimum, which meant my father had known about Ward's history, which meant he had knowingly partnered with a man who had spent years defrauding small business owners, including my grandfather, including my mother's father. I thought about the way my father had looked at the window when he told me to sign the letter. I thought about Renata and the $400,000 in consulting fees. I thought about my mother, who had died never knowing any of this, who had loved her father and loved her husband, and had no idea those 2 men had any connection at all. I drove back to Guelph that night. I didn't stop to eat. When I got to Addie's apartment, it was past 11 and she was asleep. But she had left the couch made up and a note on the kitchen counter that said leftovers in the fridge. Milk is fine until Thursday. I sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the envelope on the table in front of me. In the morning, I called Lorraine. Did you know, I asked, that Grandpa Franklin had a problem with someone named Desmond Ward? A pause. He mentioned a business dispute once, years ago. He didn't go into detail. Why? I told her what I'd found. I told her about the documents, about the share transfer, about my father's name at the bottom of the page. Lorraine was quiet for longer than I expected. Owen, she said finally, do you understand what you're holding? I think so. You need a lawyer, not a general practice lawyer. A lawyer who handles financial fraud. I didn't have money for a lawyer. I had about $400 in my checking account and a temp job that paid $22 an hour. I told Lorraine this. I'll cover the initial consultation, she said. And if what you're describing is what it sounds like, most lawyers who handle this kind of case work on contingency, or they'll know who does. Just make copies of everything first. Keep the originals somewhere that isn't your car. I made copies at the library. I kept the originals in a waterproof document bag that I bought at Canadian Tire for $11 and put in the bottom of my laundry hamper, which I felt was a reasonably unlikely place for someone to look. Then I called the lawyer Lorraine recommended, a woman named Helen Okafor, who practiced in Toronto and had spent 8 years as a Crown prosecutor before going into private practice. She agreed to see me on a Thursday morning. I borrowed Addie's car. Helen Okafor's office was on King Street West, on the 14th floor of a glass building. She was in her mid-40s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she shook my hand with the efficiency of someone who was going to decide something about me in the next 30 seconds. She looked at the documents for 22 minutes without saying anything. I watched her eyes move across the pages. The affidavits are the weakest element, she said finally. They're notarized, but the individuals may not be willing to testify. Everything else is stronger than you might expect. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means you have enough to interest the right people. She looked at me over her glasses. Have you heard of the Ontario Securities Commission? I had, in the vague way most people have heard of regulatory bodies. You know it exists. You're not sure what it does on a Tuesday. Helen explained that 1882649 Ontario Inc., the company Ward and my father co-owned, appeared from public records to have made a series of investments in a private commercial real estate fund, one that my father's company happened to manage. If those investments were structured in a way that created undisclosed conflicts of interest, that was potentially an OSC matter. And the OSC, she noted, had a whistleblower program. Successful disclosures that resulted in sanctions could result in a payment to the person who reported. How much? I asked. It depends on the sanction amount. Between 5 and 15% of penalties collected over $1 million. If what's here leads where I think it might lead, you could be looking at something significant. I drove back to Guelph in Addie's 2018 Hyundai, thinking about the word significant. The next 4 months were not dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of situation. The movies make it look like car chases and last-minute rescues, but the reality is a lot of secure email threads and waiting and more waiting and occasional phone calls from Helen, where she used phrases like, "The process is proceeding," and "They're reviewing the submission." I kept going to my temp job. I ate a lot of rotisserie chicken. Addie started letting me pay a small amount of rent, which I insisted on, because self-respect is cheap to maintain and expensive to rebuild. I heard from my father once, a brief text message in May that read only, "I know what you're doing. Stop." I showed it to Helen. She said to keep it and not respond. I didn't respond. In late June, Helen called me on a Friday afternoon and told me to come to her office on Monday morning. "Is it good?" I asked. "It's meaningful," she said, which I was starting to understand was her version of yes. The OSC, in coordination with the RCMP Commercial Crime Section, had opened a formal investigation based on my grandfather's documents and the supplementary material Helen had assembled. Desmond Ward had been interviewed. A forensic accountant had reviewed the fund records. The undisclosed conflict of interest was confirmed, and it was not the only one. The investigation had expanded in scope over the preceding weeks, and it now included potential charges relating to securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and one count under the criminal code relating to the conduct Ward had used against my grandfather and others years earlier, which fell under a broader fraud classification. Stuart Mercer, my father, had cooperated with investigators in exchange for leniency on the lesser charges. That cooperation had expanded the case against Ward considerably. Helen slid a letter across the desk to me. It was from the OSC. It confirmed that I was a registered whistleblower under the program. It outlined the next steps. I read it twice. Then I looked up. "And Renata?" I asked. "The money from the property management accounts. Separate matter. She's been served. Her counsel is negotiating." Helen allowed herself a small, professional smile. "Your father appears to be finding his loyalty somewhat redistributed." I thought about the notarized letter I had signed in January, in my father's study, with the sleet against the windows. I thought about the $2,000 and the 4 shirts and Addie's couch and the kerosene lamp on the table in my grandfather's cabin. I thought about a man who had added a codicil to his will 2 years before he died, who had replaced the padlock on a gate at a fish camp he no longer visited, who had left an envelope with my name on it in his careful handwriting, because he had a feeling about me, and he trusted that feeling more than he trusted anything else he could have done. "There's one more thing," Helen said. She passed me a second sheet. "The preliminary penalty assessment came in this morning. If the final sanctions hold at the projected level." She pointed to a number on the page. I looked at it for a moment. "That's the 5% figure," she said. "We'll argue for 7. I drove back to Guelph and parked in front of Addie's building and sat in her car for a few minutes before I went upstairs. It was a Tuesday. She was probably home from work. There was likely some leftover pasta from the weekend still in the fridge. I thought about my grandfather, standing on the dock at Wahnapatai early in the morning, the way he used to stand very still and watch the water before the rest of the camp was awake. I had asked him once, when I was small, what he was looking at, and he had said, "Nothing yet, but something usually comes along." I had been 23 years old and afraid of a man who had looked at a window rather than at his son. I had signed a letter in a study that smelled like cedar and old paper, and I had driven away in the January dark with 2 bags and a laundry hamper and nowhere clear to go. But my grandfather had left me a key. He had left me a padlock he'd replaced himself and an envelope with my name in his handwriting and 47 pages of quiet, patient, meticulous truth. He had believed, without being able to say it to my face while he was still alive, that I was the right person to carry it forward, that I would know what to do, that honest people, even when the road is harder than it should be, eventually find their footing. I went upstairs. Addie was home. I told her to sit down. "Is it bad?" she asked. "No," I said, "it's the opposite of bad." She looked at me for a moment. Then she went and put the kettle on, because that's what she always did, and I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I hadn't said anything for 40 minutes on a January night, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have anything I needed to figure out. It was already figured out. My grandfather had seen to that. From a dock on a lake in northern Ontario, in the still part of the morning, before anything else had come along yet.